The Mafia boss's hand froze mid-trigger pull. Vincent Romani had ordered 17 executions that year without hesitation. He had buried enemies, silenced witnesses, and earned his reputation as the man without a heart. But now, staring at the security footage on his private monitor, he couldn't breathe. The new janitor was mopping his penthouse floor at 3:47 a.m. Nothing unusual, except for the key hanging from her neck. Not silver, not gold, just a tarnished brass watch key on a fraying chain. A key he had stolen from a dead man 23 years ago in a frozen alley and given to a girl he had promised to marry. Before we continue with Vincent and Stella's story, do me a favor, like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Whether you're in New York, London, Manila, or somewhere in between, I'm grateful you're here. Now, let's continue. Vincent had built his empire the way other men built sandcastles, except his foundations were corpses and his moats were filled with blood. The legitimate fronts were impressive. 3 restaurants in Midtown, a construction company that actually constructed things, a waste management operation that managed more than waste. But everyone who mattered knew the restaurants laundered money through phantom reservations, the construction company poured concrete over problems that used to breathe, and the garbage trucks collected debts along with trash. He controlled Manhattan's underworld through a simple principle: absolute fear, absolutely enforced. 2 weeks before the security footage changed everything, Vincent had been eating poached eggs and reading the morning financial reports when his consigliere brought in a man who'd been skimming from the Brooklyn docks. Vincent listened to the pleading for exactly 45 seconds, pulled his Beretta from a shoulder holster beneath his breakfast jacket, and put 2 bullets in a man's chest. He returned to his eggs without looking at the body. They'd gone cold. He ate them anyway, turning pages with his left hand while his right still held the gun. His soldiers talked about it in whispers. The boss who didn't blink. The man whose heart had calcified somewhere in the distant past, leaving only ice and precision. What they didn't talk about, because Vincent killed men for noticing his weaknesses, was the insomnia. 15 years without sleeping more than 3 hours straight. 15 years of 4 a.m. walks through his penthouse, checking locks, reviewing surveillance feeds, ensuring every window, every door, every possible entry point remained sealed against a world that wanted him dead. His doctor-prescribed pills Vincent never took. Sleep meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant death. 3 days before Stella Harris walked into his life again, Vincent had fired his entire cleaning staff. All 12 of them. The head of his security detail found him at 2 a.m. standing in front of an unlocked window in the guest bathroom, staring at the 18-story drop to the street below. Someone had opened it to let in air while cleaning and forgotten to close it. Just forgot. As if forgetting didn't mean assassination. As if carelessness wasn't collaboration with his enemies. By sunrise, the entire crew was gone. Vincent spent the next 72 hours personally vetting replacements, running background checks that went back 3 generations, examining tax returns and parking tickets and elementary school disciplinary records. Stella Harris's file was unremarkable to the point of invisibility. 18 years experience with commercial cleaning services. No criminal record. No family. No debt. No vices. No complications. She'd cleaned office buildings, hotel corridors, hospital wings. Quiet. Thorough. Unremarkable. His head of security approved her. Vincent barely glanced at the photograph. She started on a Tuesday night, arriving at 11 p.m. with her own supplies and a silence that filled rooms. Vincent watched her on the monitors for the first hour, standard protocol, then returned to his desk, to contracts that needed signing, to problems that needed permanent solutions. At 6:30 a.m., his consigliere found him asleep in his office chair, head resting on folded arms, breathing deep and even. 7 hours. The first time in 15 years. No one mentioned it. Mentioning the boss's vulnerabilities was suicide. But Vincent knew. And 3 nights later, when he saw the brass key swinging from her neck on the security footage, he understood why his body had finally surrendered to sleep. It recognized her before his mind could admit the impossible. Vincent watched the footage 3 times before his hands stopped shaking. 3:47 a.m. Stella bent to retrieve a fallen pen from beneath his desk, and the brass key swung forward from her neck, catching the lamplight for exactly 2 seconds before disappearing back beneath her uniform collar. 2 seconds to destroy 23 years of carefully constructed amnesia. The past arrived in fragments, brutal and precise. Winter. Always winter in his memories, as if the cold had frozen those years into permanent ice. He was 15, she was 13, and they survived in the skeleton of an abandoned tenement on the Lower East Side that the city had condemned but forgotten to demolish. They had each other and nothing else. No families. Those had dissolved into addiction or abandonment or death long before. No homes except the third-floor corner where broken pipes no longer leaked and wind couldn't reach. They stole to eat. Bread from bakery loading docks at 4 a.m. Fruit from corner markets while vendors argued with morning delivery trucks. Once, a whole roasted chicken that someone had left on a windowsill to cool. They'd burned their fingers tearing it apart, laughing and weeping simultaneously because they couldn't remember the last time they tasted meat. At night they huddled together for warmth, her small body pressed against his chest, both of them wearing every piece of clothing they owned. Vincent would tell her stories about the future, absurd fantasies about apartments with heat and beds with clean sheets and eating until their stomachs hurt from fullness instead of emptiness. "When we get out of here," he'd whisper into her hair, "I'll marry you. I promise." She'd laugh, breath fogging in the frozen air. "With what ring?" "I'll find one. I'll steal the biggest diamond in the city." "I don't need diamonds," she'd say, already half asleep. "Just something that means you remember." The dead man appeared in February. Vincent found him in the alley behind a shuttered pawn shop, frozen in the position he'd died in, one hand still clutching his chest where the heart attack or bullet or knife had stopped him. The cold had preserved him like a grotesque statue. Vincent searched the body with practiced efficiency. Wallet, empty. Shoes, too large. Coat, blood-stained and useless. Then his fingers found the pocket watch in the inside vest pocket. Brass, tarnished, ornate engravings worn almost smooth. Heavy. Real. He brought it back to Stella like a hunter returning with fresh kill. "Look." He held it up to the thin morning light filtering through broken windows. "This is worth something. This gets us out." The watch didn't open properly. The mechanism had rusted shut decades ago. But there was a small key attached to the chain, delicate and precisely crafted, meant to win the movement back to life. Vincent removed the key, placed it in Stella's palm, closed her fingers around it. "You keep this. When this watch brings us money, I'll marry you. That's your proof I meant it." She wore it on a piece of string around her neck. Her only possession besides the clothes she slept in. The watch never worked. Vincent tried selling it to 3 different pawn shops. They all laughed. Brass. Broken. Worthless. Maybe $5 for scrap. He still had it in his pocket 2 weeks later when Don Carmine Marconi's black Lincoln pulled up beside him. Vincent had just beaten 2 older boys half to death for trying to take their corner, their territory, their only reliable place to steal from morning deliveries. His knuckles were split, his face was bleeding, and he was smiling. Marconi saw something in that smile. The old man rolled down the window. "You fight like you've got nothing to lose." "I don't," Vincent said. "How old are you?" 15. "You want to stay 15 forever, sleeping in that death trap on Delancey? Or you want to become someone?" Vincent's heart had stopped. Literally stopped, then restarted with painful force. "What's the cost?" Marconi's eyes were dark, ancient, knowing. "The past dies tonight. No one from before. No weakness. You become my son, but only if you bury whoever you were." Vincent looked back at the tenement. 3rd floor. Corner window. Stella would be sleeping now, her hand probably clutching the brass key beneath her shirt the way she always did. He could say no. He could go back. They could freeze together for another winter, another year, until cold or hunger or violence finally finished what poverty had started. Or he could choose life. Power. The chance to become someone who never had to steal chicken from windowsills again. "Okay," Vincent said. He didn't go back for his things. Didn't leave a note. Didn't say goodbye. He climbed into Marconi's warm car, and the door closed with the solid thunk of expensive engineering. Through the window, he could see the tenement growing smaller. He never looked back. And for 23 years, he never let himself remember the brass key or the girl who wore it or the promise that had meant everything when he'd had nothing to give. Until 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, when the past stopped being dead and started mopping his floors. Vincent spent 4 days planning how to speak to her. 4 days drafting opening lines in his head, each one dying before reaching his throat. The words felt like admissions of weakness, and weakness was what men like him couldn't afford. His survival instinct, The same one that had kept him alive through turf wars and betrayals and the constant mathematics of violence, screamed at him to stay silent, to let the past remain buried. So instead of speaking, he tested. The rusted tin can appeared on his kitchen counter on a Thursday morning. Vincent had kept it in a storage unit for 15 years, paying monthly fees to preserve relics he'd told himself he'd thrown away. It was the size of a soup can, dented and discolored, edges sharp where they'd used a stolen knife to saw off the top. Their cooking pot. They'd boiled stolen potatoes in it over fires made from broken furniture, taking turns holding it with rags wrapped around their hands. He placed it among the expensive copper cookware and watched the security feed. Stella cleaned around it for 3 nights. She'd approach, stop, move to another task. On the 4th night, at 2:17 a.m., she finally picked it up. Vincent leaned closer to the monitor, watching her turn it slowly in her hands. She washed it with dish soap, dried it carefully with a clean towel, and placed it in the cabinet beside his espresso maker, the only cheap object among thousands of dollars of Italian engineering. She didn't ask. Didn't leave a note. Just accepted its presence the way you accept ghosts. Test 2 came 5 nights later. Vincent queued up Claire de Lune on his office speakers, volume low, door open. The melody drifted into the hallway where Stella pushed her cleaning cart. They'd found a broken music box once, in a dumpster behind a theater. It had played this exact piece, stuttering and grinding, but beautiful enough to make Stella cry. They'd listened to it every night for 2 weeks until the mechanism finally seized completely. Vincent watched her stop mopping midstroke. She stood absolutely still, mop handle gripped in both hands, head slightly tilted. He counted. 47 seconds without moving, without breathing, a statue in a navy uniform. Then she resumed mopping, her pace unchanged, her expression empty. But her hands trembled for the next 20 minutes. The photograph for Test 3 came from his private investigator's files. The old tenement on Delancey, photographed 6 months before demolition finally claimed it. Vincent printed it, crumpled it slightly to suggest accident, and left it in his office wastebasket. At 4:12 a.m., Stella's hand reached into the frame of the security camera. She removed the photograph, smoothed it against her thigh with careful deliberation, and placed it on his desk. No note. No message. Just the evidence that she'd seen it, recognized it, couldn't let it be destroyed. Vincent stared at the photograph sitting in the center of his mahogany desk for 3 hours after she left. Each test confirmed what he already knew but couldn't admit. She recognized him. Remembered everything. The tin can, the music, the frozen rooms where they'd survived together. And she was choosing silence with the same deliberate care he was. The realization arrived slowly, then all at once. She wasn't protecting herself from the confrontation. She was protecting *Kim Star. From the shame, from the admission, from the vulnerability of acknowledging that the feared mafia boss had once been a terrified boy who'd made promises he'd abandoned. She was giving him permission to pretend she was just the janitor, and he was just the boss, and 23 years ago had never happened. It was the kindest cruelty anyone had ever offered him. On the 7th night after the photograph, Vincent changed his routine. He left his office door open while she worked. Not all the way. That would be too obvious. Just enough that she could see him sitting in his leather chair, pretending to read contracts he'd already memorized. Positioned so she was in his peripheral vision. Close enough that he could speak if he found the courage. She mopped the hallway outside his door. He turned pages he wasn't reading. Neither of them spoke. But the distance between them, 15 feet of marble floor and 23 years of silence, felt like it was shrinking. Incrementally. Dangerously. Vincent found himself arriving at his office earlier on the nights she worked, leaving his door open wider, creating small messes that required her to enter his space, a dropped pen, papers scattered near the trash can, coffee cups left on the side table. Each mess was an invitation he was too afraid to speak aloud. Each time she cleaned them, efficiently and silently, it felt like an answer to a question neither of them could ask. The unbearable distance became Vincent's new insomnia. He traded sleepless nights pacing for sleepless nights watching security monitors, tracking Stella's movements through his penthouse like a man studying enemy territory. Except she wasn't the enemy. She was the ghost of every choice he'd made to survive, moving silently through rooms he'd bought with blood. His behavior shifted in ways his men noticed but knew better than to mention. Vincent lingered in hallways now, manufacturing reasons to be present when Stella worked. He'd stand at the windows pretending to look at the Manhattan skyline while she emptied trash cans behind him. He'd make coffee at 2 a.m. when he never drank coffee after 8. He'd leave his bedroom door open while reading, the lamplight spilling into the corridor where she pushed her cart. His consigliere, Michael Torino, finally broke protocol on a Wednesday afternoon. They were alone in Vincent's study, reviewing the weekly collections from their Brooklyn operations. Michael set down the ledger and looked at his boss with the careful expression of a man approaching a minefield. "The cleaning woman," Michael said quietly. "Is there a problem?" Vincent's eyes went cold. Why would there be a problem? "You've been present during her shifts. The men are asking questions. Tell the men to focus on their own business." Michael held his gaze for 3 seconds, the maximum length of time anyone could safely question Vincent Romani, then nodded and returned to the ledger. But the unspoken truth sat between them like a third person in the room. What Michael didn't say, what he couldn't know, Vincent had been tracking Stella for 7 years. The file sat in Vincent's private safe, thick with surveillance reports and photographs. He'd discovered her location 3 years after joining Marconi's family, when he'd finally accumulated enough power to hire investigators without explaining why. The reports came monthly. Where she lived, where she worked, her routines, her habits, the churches she attended, the grocery store she frequented. She'd worked as a maid in office buildings, hotels, hospitals. She moved apartments every few years, always staying in modest neighborhoods, always alone. Never married. No children. No close friends that the investigators could identify. She sent money monthly to a foster care charity in the Bronx, always exactly $200, always on the 15th. Vincent had read every report, memorized every detail, and done absolutely nothing. For 7 years he'd watched her life from a distance, paralyzed by shame that metastasized into something darker. He told himself he was ensuring her safety, making sure she was okay, fulfilling some residual responsibility from their shared past. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. He was too much of a coward to face her. So when his entire cleaning staff was fired and replacements were being vetted, Vincent had done something he'd never done before. He'd manipulated the selection process. A quiet word to his head of security. Specific criteria that only one candidate happened to meet perfectly. The hiring decision that seemed random but was anything but. He'd brought her here. Into his home. Into his carefully constructed empire of violence and expensive silence. And now he didn't know what to do with her. The territorial meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. All 5 families gathering at Vincent's compound in Westchester. Neutral ground for negotiations over boundaries and tribute percentages. High-stakes diplomacy backed by the implicit threat of war. Vincent's assistant had already arranged for extra security, catering, accommodations for the bosses who'd stay overnight. The meetings typically lasted 12 to 14 hours, sometimes stretching into the next day when disagreements needed careful resolution. Stella had requested to work that night. The request came through the cleaning service's scheduling coordinator, a simple notation that Ms. Harris was available for the additional hours required when Vincent hosted large events. Extra security meant extra cleaning. Nothing unusual. Vincent stared at the schedule for 20 minutes. He could say no. Create some excuse. Security concerns. Schedule conflicts. Anything. But saying no would require explanation, and explanation would reveal that she mattered. That the janitor was somehow important enough to warrant special consideration from a man who'd executed people for less than looking at him wrong. He approved the request. That night, Vincent sat in his office with the door fully open for the first time. Not pretending to read. Not manufacturing busy work. Just sitting in his chair, hands folded, watching the hallway where Stella moved between rooms with her cart. She knew he was watching. Her movements became slightly more deliberate, her pace measured. She didn't look at him directly, but her awareness of his presence was palpable, the way prey knows the predator is near without needing to see it. At 3:27 a.m., she stopped outside his door. Didn't enter. Didn't speak. Just stopped, her hand resting on the cart handle, her profile visible in the doorframe. Vincent's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment. All he had to do was say her name. Just her name. The rest would follow. His throat closed. 47 seconds passed. The same duration she'd stood frozen listening to Claire de Lune. Then Stella moved on, continuing down the hallway, and the moment dissolved like smoke. Vincent exhaled slowly, his hands trembling against the armrests. 5 days until the territorial meeting. 5 days until all 5 families gathered under his roof. 5 days until Stella would be visible to men who noticed everything and forgot nothing. He should send her away. Protect her from what was coming. But Vincent Romani had built his empire on ruthless calculation, and he understood the truth. He'd orchestrated this collision. Brought her here. Approved her schedule. Left his door open. Because after 23 years of silence, he needed someone else to force the confrontation he was too afraid to begin himself. The 5 families arrived at Vincent's Westchester compound like warring nations coming to treaty. Black SUVs with tinted windows rolled through the gates in careful succession, each vehicle representing a different territory, a different empire built on the same foundation of blood and money. Vincent watched from the second-floor window as his security detail processed each arrival with metal detectors and pat-downs that everyone pretended not to find insulting. Marco DeLuca arrived last, deliberately. He always did. Making entrances was part of his brand, the peacock approach to power that Vincent found contemptible but effective. Marco ran the Bronx with theatrical brutality, the kind of boss who wore too much cologne and made sure everyone knew the exact price of his shoes. 38 years old and already controlling more territory than men twice his age. Ambitious. Dangerous. Stupid enough to mistake Vincent's restraint for weakness. The conference room had been prepared with surgical precision. Round table to avoid hierarchy disputes. Equal distance between all chairs. Scotch and wine, but nothing strong enough to impair judgment. Ashtrays for the old-timers who still smoke cigars during negotiation. Everything calibrated to prevent insult, while facilitating the delicate choreography of organized crime diplomacy. Vincent took his seat at exactly 7 p.m. The other bosses followed. Sal Giordano from Queens, Tommy Chen, who'd taken over Chinatown after his father's retirement, Luis Vega representing the Washington Heights operations, and Marco DeLuca, adjusting his cufflinks before sitting like a man preparing for a photo shoot. "Gentlemen," Vincent began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who didn't need to raise it. "We have boundary disputes to resolve and new tribute structures to discuss. I suggest we start with Brooklyn." The negotiations proceeded with practiced efficiency. Percentages were debated, territories were clarified, compromises were reached through the implicit mathematics of mutual destruction. By 10 p.m. they'd resolved the Brooklyn situation. By midnight, the Queen's boundaries were settled. Stella appeared at 12:47 a.m. Vincent saw her before anyone else did, his peripheral vision tracking her entrance through the service door with the cleaning cart. She wore the same navy uniform, the same quiet efficiency. She began in the corners of the room, emptying ashtrays, replacing water glasses, moving with the invisibility that service workers cultivate to survive in rooms where powerful men conduct dangerous business. The brass key hung from her neck, visible when she bent forward. Vincent forced himself to look away, to focus on Luis Vega's proposal about splitting protection revenues in Washington Heights. But his awareness of Stella's presence was absolute, a frequency only he could hear in a room full of noise. Marco noticed her at 1:15 a.m. Vincent watched it happen. Marco's eyes tracking Stella as she moved behind Tommy Chen's chair, his gaze lingering in a way that made Vincent's jaw tighten. Marco was drunk, not falling down drunk, but loose enough that his natural cruelty was unfiltered. "Nice help you got, Vincent," Marco said, interrupting Sal Giordano mid-sentence. "Very thorough." The room went quiet. Complimenting another man's staff was either genuine or threat, and everyone knew Marco didn't do genuine. "She's professional," Vincent said, his tone flat. "Warning." Marco smiled, the expression sharp with malice. "Professional. Right." He gestured for Stella to approach. "Sweetheart, come here. Refresh my drink." Stella moved to the sidebar, poured scotch into Marco's glass with steady hands, brought it to him without meeting his eyes. The brass key swung forward as she leaned to place the glass on the table. Marco's hand shot out, catching the key mid-swing. "What the fuck is this?" He yanked it closer, pulling Stella off balance. "Looks like something you'd find in a dumpster. You collect trash, sweetheart." Vincent's vision narrowed. The room receded to a tunnel. Marco's hand on the chain, Stella's neck straining forward, the brass key catching lamplight. "Marco." Vincent's voice could have frozen blood. "Let go." Marco looked up, surprised, then amused. "What? You care about the help's jewelry now? This ghetto trash?" He yanked harder, the chain biting into Stella's neck. "I'm just curious what kind of." The chain snapped. Marco held the key up like a trophy, laughing. Cheap shit breaks easy. Just like. He didn't finish the sentence because Vincent was already standing, already moving. 3 steps around the table. His hand went to the Beretta holstered beneath his jacket. Muscle memory, smooth and practiced. Vincent. Sal Giordano's voice, cautious. Think about what you're doing. Vincent wasn't thinking. For the first time in 23 years, he wasn't calculating odds or considering consequences or managing the careful mathematics that kept Empire stable. He was 15 years old again, watching the only person who'd ever mattered to him reach for warmth she'd never find. Marco saw death coming. His smile faltered. He stood quickly, hands raising in mock surrender, still holding the brass key. Jesus Christ, Vincent, it's a joke. I was just. Give it back, Vincent said quietly. It's a piece of garbage. Look at it. Marco dangled the key between them. What, you fucking the help? Is that why you're? Vincent shot him. 3 times. Center mass. The Beretta's reports were deafening in the enclosed space, followed by the heavy sound of Marco DeLuca's body hitting the floor. The room exploded into motion. Chairs scraping back, hands reaching for weapons, voices shouting. But Vincent's men were already moving, flooding through the doors, guns drawn, creating a perimeter that made it clear. Anyone who reached for a weapon would die next. Vincent walked to Marco's body, knelt in his $8,000 Brioni suit, and picked up the brass key from where it had fallen. The metal was warm from Marco's hand. There was blood on the chain. He stood slowly, turned to face the room. 4 bosses and 20 soldiers, all frozen, all watching the man who just executed a rival boss over a piece of worthless brass. The meeting, Vincent said calmly, is over. Nobody moved. Vincent walked to Stella, who stood exactly where Marco had pulled her, her hand at her throat where the chain had broken. Her eyes were wide, not with fear but with something deeper, recognition, maybe, or grief. He held out the key. She took it with trembling fingers, clutched it to her chest. I'm sorry, Vincent said. Loud enough for everyone to hear. Not apologizing for the execution. He'd never apologize for that. Apologizing for 23 years ago. For leaving. For every choice that had led to this moment where the only way he could protect her was by killing in front of witnesses. Stella's lips parted. For a moment, Vincent thought she might speak, might say his name, might acknowledge the boy he used to be in front of all these men who only knew the monster. Instead, she turned and walked out of the conference room, the cleaning cart abandoned, the brass key pressed against her heart. Vincent watched her go, then turned back to the room full of witnesses. Sal, have your men help dispose of the body. Tommy, Lewis, we'll reschedule. My apologies for cutting the evening short. He walked out, leaving Marco DeLuca cooling on the floor, leaving 4 shell-shocked bosses to process what they'd witnessed, leaving his entire carefully constructed reputation in ruins. Because some things, Vincent had just discovered, were worth more than Empire. Some things were worth everything. Stella was gone by sunrise. Vincent discovered it at 6:23 a.m. when he went to her small staff quarters in the East Wing, a converted storage room he'd never actually seen before, now empty except for industrial cleaning supplies and the faint scent of the lavender soap she used. The bed was made with hospital corners. The single towel hung perfectly aligned on the rack. No personal items. No evidence she'd ever been there at all. Except for the envelope on the pillow, his name written in careful script on the front. Vincent's hand shook as he opened it. His soldiers were still cleaning blood from the conference room floor. Marco DeLuca's body was already in the industrial incinerator on the property's edge. The sun was rising over Westchester, painting his compound in shades of gold and pink that felt obscene given what the night had held. The letter was written on plain paper, the handwriting precise and measured. Vincent, I came to see what you became. I told myself I just needed to know if you were alive, if you were happy, if leaving me was worth it. But that was a lie. I came to see if the boy who promised to marry me survived inside the man who kills without blinking. I don't blame you for leaving. I would have chosen Marconi's car too. Survival isn't noble, it's necessary. You stayed alive. That's enough. But I can't stay now because you didn't just survive. You chose this. You chose violence, chose power, chose to become the thing we feared in those alleys. And I can't watch you sink deeper. The key mattered because you gave it to me when you had nothing. Not because you came back for it. Thank you for kneeling. Thank you for killing for me. But I needed you to live for me instead. I hope you find peace in your empire. I'll find mine somewhere else. Stella. Vincent read it 11 times. The first time, standing in her empty room, his vision blurring at the edges. The second through 5th time sitting on her bed, the paper trembling in his hands. The 6th time in his office, the door locked, his Beretta on the desk in front of him like an accusation. Time 7 through 10 throughout the day, between phone calls with his lawyers and meetings with his captains, the letter folded and unfolded until the creases began to tear. The 11th time was at 3:47 a.m., the exact time he'd first seen the brass key on the security footage. Sitting in the dark of his penthouse office, the letter spread on his desk under the single lamp. I needed you to live for me instead. 6 words. The complete dismantling of 23 years of careful construction. Vincent didn't leave his office for 6 days. Food appeared on trays outside his door, brought by soldiers who knew better than to knock. His consigliere Michael handled the organizational chaos, Marco DeLuca's family demanding explanation, the other families circling like sharks scenting blood in the water, everyone waiting to see if Vincent Romani had finally shown enough weakness to be destroyed. On the 3rd day, Michael found him weeping. Vincent heard the door open, knew he should compose himself, couldn't. He sat in his leather chair with his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs he'd locked away since the night he climbed into Marconi's black car and learned that surviving meant killing everything soft inside himself. Michael stood in the doorway for a long moment, then quietly closed the door and sat in the chair across from Vincent's desk. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just sat there while his boss, the man who'd executed 34 people that year without blinking, fell apart completely. When Vincent finally looked up, his face was ravaged, eyes red and swollen. I was 15, he said, his voice wrecked. She was 13. We had nothing. And I left her sleeping in a building that should have killed her. Michael nodded slowly. The cleaning woman. Stella. Her name is Stella Harris. You've known her before. She was my whole world before I had a world. Vincent gestured at the office, the compound beyond, the empire built on bones. All of this. Everything I became. I did it because I thought survival required it. But she survived too, Michael. Without killing anyone. Without becoming a monster. You're not a monster, Vincent. I shot a man in front of witnesses because he touched something that belonged to her. I've been watching her for 7 years without having the courage to speak. I brought her here, into this, because I was too much of a coward to face her anywhere else. Vincent picked up the letter, his hand steady now with exhaustion. She came to see if I was still human. And I proved I wasn't. Michael was quiet for a long time. Then, Marco DeLuca's family has agreed to terms. They're calling it a justified response to disrespect. The other families are watching, but no one's moving against us. I don't care. Vincent. I don't care about Marco's family or the other families or any of it. Vincent stood, walked to the window overlooking the grounds where he'd built his fortress against a world that wanted him dead. What's the point? What the fuck is the point of any of this if I can't even speak to the only person who ever knew me before blood? Then find her, Michael said simply. You're Vincent Romani. You have investigators, resources, connections in every city on the East Coast. Find her and speak to her. She doesn't want to be found. She made that clear. Did she? Michael gestured to the letter. Or did she tell you exactly what she needs you to do? Stop killing for her. Start living for her. That's not a goodbye, Vincent. That's an invitation. Vincent read the letter for the 12th time, seeing it differently now. Not a rejection. A challenge. The same kind of challenge she'd issued with the tests, the tin can, the music, the photograph. Each one asking, are you still in there? Is the boy still somewhere inside the monster? She's in Baltimore, Vincent said quietly. Her apartment is in Fells Point. 3rd floor walk up. She's been there for 2 years. Michael's eyebrows rose. You know where she is. I've always known where she is. Then what are you waiting for? Vincent looked at his consigliere, this man who'd helped him bury bodies and broker peace and build an empire on fear. Permission, he said finally. I'm waiting for permission to be something other than this. You don't need permission, Vincent. You need courage. Michael stood, moved toward the door. The same courage it took to survive when you were 15. Except this time, you're not running toward power. You're running toward the only thing that ever mattered before power taught you not to care. After Michael left, Vincent sat in his office for another 3 hours. Then he made 4 phone calls. The first to his lawyer, arranging temporary operational authority for Michael. The second to his head of security, requesting a single driver and no additional personnel. The third to his accountant, accessing funds from accounts nobody knew existed. The fourth to a jeweler in Manhattan who owed him favors he'd never collected. At 11 p.m. on the 6th day after Stella disappeared, Vincent Romani walked out of his compound carrying a small velvet box in his jacket pocket. No security detail. No weapons. No armor except a suit that cost more than most people's cars and a brass key, newly polished, attached to a delicate gold chain, that he'd commissioned to match the one he'd stolen 23 years ago from a dead man in an alley. He climbed into the back of a town car and gave the driver an address in Baltimore. "How long will we be staying, sir?" the driver asked. Vincent looked out the window at the compound where he'd built his empire, at the gates that kept the world out and kept him trapped inside his own carefully constructed cage. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe forever. Maybe 5 minutes. Just drive." The car pulled away, leaving the empire behind, carrying a man who'd finally found something more terrifying than death, the possibility of redemption, and all the vulnerability it required. Baltimore appeared through the car window like a city built from Stella's absence. Vincent had never been here. His empire ended at the Maryland border, territories negotiated and respected through the careful diplomacy of organized crime. This was someone else's kingdom. He was just a man in an expensive suit carrying a brass key and 23 years of cowardice. The driver navigated through Fells Point with GPS precision. Narrow streets lined with brick rowhouses, bars with neon signs advertising craft beer, young professionals walking dogs past corners where previous generations had conducted different kinds of business. Gentrification wearing the mask of historical preservation. Stella's building was painted navy blue, sandwiched between a coffee shop and a vintage clothing store. 5 floors, iron fire escape zigzagging up the facade, windows with actual curtains instead of blinds. Modest but maintained. The kind of place where people lived actual lives instead of just surviving. Vincent told the driver to wait, then stood on the sidewalk staring up at the 3rd-floor corner unit where his investigators had reported Stella Harris resided. Lights were on behind yellow curtains. She was home. Awake at 2:47 a.m., because some kinds of insomnia didn't require power or enemies. Sometimes loss and loneliness were enough. The velvet box in his pocket felt heavier than his Beretta ever had. Inside, the new brass key, polished, purposeful, attached to a delicate gold chain. He'd commissioned it from a jeweler in Manhattan who owed him favors, had it crafted to match the original he'd stolen from a corpse 23 years ago. Proof that he remembered. Evidence that somewhere beneath the violence and empire, the boy who'd made promises still existed. Vincent climbed the stairs slowly. No elevator in a building this old, just 5 flights of worn wooden steps that creaked beneath his weight. Each floor was a negotiation with himself. He could turn back. Send flowers. Send money. Send anything except himself, his actual presence, his vulnerability wrapped in tailored wool and desperation. At the 3rd-floor landing, he stopped. Apartment 3C. Yellow light visible beneath the door. He could hear music playing softly, not Claire de Lune, something modern he didn't recognize. Evidence of a life he knew nothing about. 20 years of experiences and choices and small moments that his investigators couldn't capture in their monthly reports. Vincent raised his hand to knock, then lowered it. Raised it again. This was insane. She'd left for a reason. She'd made herself clear. Showing up at her door at 3 a.m. was stalker behavior, not. The door opened. Stella stood there in a simple cotton robe, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in the severe bun she wore for work. The brass key, the original, tarnished one, hung from a new chain around her neck. She looked at him without surprise, without fear, with something closer to weary inevitability. "I wondered how long it would take," she said quietly. Vincent's prepared speech dissolved. All the careful words he'd rehearsed during the 3-hour drive evaporated, leaving only truth. "I knew where you were for 7 years." His voice was raw from 6 days of not speaking to anyone who mattered. "I did nothing because I was afraid you'd see what I became. I was right to be afraid." Stella studied him for a long moment, this man in his expensive suit standing in her humble hallway, trembling like the 15-year-old boy who used to hold her in frozen rooms and promise impossible futures. "You killed a man because he touched my key," she said. "Not accusation. Statement of fact. Yes. That's not living for me, Vincent. That's dying for me in a different way." "I know." He pulled the velvet box from his pocket, opened it with shaking hands. The new brass key caught the hallway light. "I don't know how to live for you. I've spent 23 years learning how to kill and survive and control. But if you let me try." He held out the box. "Just let me try to be the man who deserved that promise." Stella looked at the new key, polished and perfect, then at the tarnished one hanging from her neck. Her hand rose to touch it, the metal worn smooth from decades of holding. "Do you know what this key meant to me?" Her voice was soft but steady. It was proof that in a world that takes everything, someone would steal for me. Risk for me. Remember me. She met his eyes. "You gave it to me when you had nothing. That's why it mattered. Not because you came back for it 23 years later with money and guilt. I'm not trying to buy forgiveness." "Then what are you trying to do?" Vincent's throat closed. The answer was too big, too vulnerable, too honest for a man who'd built his life on controlled information and calculated responses. But Stella's eyes, the same eyes that had watched him disappear into Marconi's black car, demanded nothing less than complete truth. "I'm trying to find out if I'm still human," he whispered. "If there's anything left of the boy who loved you before violence taught him not to feel. If redemption is possible for someone who's done what I've done." He closed the box, lowered his hand. "And I'm terrified the answer is no." Stella was quiet for so long Vincent thought she might close the door. End this with the finality he probably deserved. Then she stepped back, opening the door wider. "Show me," she said. "Show me the boy is still somewhere inside, and I'll help you find him." Vincent walked into her apartment like a man walking into salvation he hadn't earned. The space was small, a studio with a kitchenette, a bed in the corner, a single armchair by the window. Everything clean and modest and completely unlike the penthouse he'd left behind. It smelled like lavender and coffee and something else he couldn't identify until he realized. It smelled like peace. Stella closed the door, and the sound of the lock clicking shut felt like the end of one life and the terrifying beginning of another. They sat, Stella in the armchair, Vincent on the edge of her bed because there was nowhere else. The brass keys hung between them, hers tarnished and real, his polished and desperate. "Tell me," Stella said. "Tell me about the 7 years you watched me and did nothing." So Vincent told her. About the investigators. The monthly reports. The addresses and jobs and routines he'd memorized while maintaining absolute distance. About knowing she sent money to foster care programs and wondering if she was trying to save other children the way no one had saved them. About the file in his safe that proved he'd never forgotten even as he'd built an empire on forgetting everything that made him human. And as he spoke, the tears came again. Not the violent sobs from his office, but quiet steady tears that ran down his face while Stella listened to the confession of a man who'd spent 23 years becoming a monster and couldn't find his way back alone. When the words finally ran out, Stella stood. For a moment Vincent thought she was asking him to leave. Instead, she crossed the small space, knelt in front of him, and pulled his head to her shoulder. Vincent broke. He wept like the 15-year-old boy who'd left her sleeping. Wept for every execution, every betrayal, every choice that had led him away from this, from simple human contact, from being held, from someone who knew him before blood. Stella held him, her hand gentle on the back of his head, and for the first time in 23 years, Vincent Romani felt like he might survive becoming human again. Stella moved into Vincent's world 3 months later, but not the way anyone expected. She refused the penthouse, refused the security detail, refused to be hidden in expensive rooms like a secret Vincent was ashamed of or a weakness his enemies could exploit. Instead, she kept her apartment in Baltimore and spent weekdays there, traveling to New York on weekends in her own car, arriving at Vincent's compound like a visitor rather than a possession. His men didn't know what to make of her. The woman the boss had killed for, who showed up in a 12-year-old Honda and declined the guest suite in favor of sleeping in Vincent's private quarters. Who said no thank you to jewelry and yes please to books. Who looked at soldiers carrying automatic weapons and asked them politely to move so she could vacuum. But what confused them most was where she worked. Not Vincent's penthouse, that had been cleaned by a professional service since the night she'd left. Instead, Stella spent her mornings at a community center in Alphabet City, the neighborhood where she and Vincent had survived as children. The building had been scheduled for demolition until an anonymous donor purchased it, renovated it completely, and converted it into a space for after-school programs and job training. Vincent's men knew who the anonymous donor was. They'd processed the payments, created the shell companies, handled the construction contracts. What they didn't understand was why their boss, a man who'd built his empire on protection rackets and illegal operations, was financing something that generated exactly zero profit. "It's an investment," Michael Torino said when one of the younger soldiers asked. "Don't question it." But it wasn't an investment in money. It was an investment in the possibility that Vincent Romani could build something instead of taking it, could protect without extorting, could use power for something other than accumulating more power. Stella cleaned the community center every morning, mopped floors, wiped down tables, organized supply closets. Work she didn't need to do, in a building Vincent owned, for no pay. When he asked her why, she'd said simply, "Because I want to. Because choosing to clean is different than having to clean. Because this building matters." Vincent began redirecting. The protection rackets continued. His empire still ran on fear and tribute, but the nature of protection shifted. Businesses that paid for Vincent's protection actually received it. When a restaurant owner in Little Italy was being harassed by teenagers, Vincent's men didn't break bones. They talked to the kids' parents, offered the teenagers jobs in construction, solved the problem without bloodshed. Violence became last resort instead of first response. His captains noticed. Some approved. Violence attracted attention, and attention meant federal investigations. Others worried. Restraint looked like weakness, and weakness invited challenges. But no one questioned Vincent directly, because the boss who'd executed Marco DeLuca over a brass key was clearly still capable of killing when necessary. 6 months after Baltimore, Vincent opened a bakery. Not a front for money laundering. Not a cover for illegal operations. An actual bakery, with legitimate permits and health inspections and a business plan created by consultants who specialized in small business development. He put it in Stella's name, the deed, and all operating documents listing her as sole owner. The building was in Alphabet City, 3 blocks from the community center. The equipment was top of the line. The initial inventory was carefully curated by a baker Vincent hired from a prestigious culinary school. Everything designed to succeed on its own merits, not because Vincent Romani's name was attached. He gave Stella the keys on a Sunday morning, the two of them standing in front of the empty storefront with its fresh paint and new windows. "I don't know how to run a bakery," Stella said, holding the keys in her palm. "Neither do I. But I hired people who do. They'll teach you, if you want to learn." Vincent pulled the velvet box from his pocket, the same one he'd brought to Baltimore, the polished brass key still inside. "Or you can sell it, close it, do whatever you want. It's yours. The first thing I've built instead of taken." Stella looked at the new key, then at the tarnished one still hanging from her neck. She'd worn it every day for 23 years, through poverty and survival and Vincent's reappearance. Proof that someone had once cared enough to steal for her. She took the new key from the box, held both in her hands. The stolen one from survival. The given one from choice. "Help me put it on," she said. Vincent attached the new key to the chain beside the old one. 2 brass keys, different but matching, hanging together against Stella's collarbone. Past and present. Survival and hope. The promise made and the promise being kept, finally, in a way that mattered. "I needed 23 years in darkness to understand what light costs," Vincent said quietly. "I needed to become a monster to understand why being human matters. I needed to lose you to know what I'd thrown away. And now—" Stella's hand rose to touch both keys. "Now I'm trying to learn how to live in light. How to build instead of destroy. How to be the man who deserved that first key." He gestured at the bakery. "I don't know if I'll ever be good. But maybe I can be better." Stella studied him for a long moment. This man who'd killed for her, wept for her, was now trying desperately to live for her in ways that didn't involve violence. "Ask me," she said. Vincent's heart stopped. "Ask you what?" "What you promised when we were children. When you gave me that key and said someday." She touched the tarnished brass, worn smooth from decades of holding. "Ask me properly." Vincent knelt on the sidewalk in front of the bakery he'd built for her, in the neighborhood where they'd survived together, in full view of morning pedestrians and his security detail parked discreetly down the block. "Stella Harris," he said, his voice steady despite his shaking hands. I'm not the boy who made you that promise. I'm something darker, something damaged, something still learning how to be human again. But if you'll have me, not someday, but now, I'll spend whatever life I have left trying to deserve you. Stella pulled him to his feet, her hands warm on his scarred knuckles. Yes, she said. But we do this slowly. We build this the way you're building that bakery, with actual foundation, actual work, actual investment in something real. No grand gestures. No expensive weddings. Just two people learning how to be together after being alone for too long. How long? Vincent asked. However long it takes. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her since they were children. We've already waited 23 years. What's a little longer? They didn't marry that year, or the next. Marriage became something they moved towards slowly, carefully, building trust the way contractors built the bakery, one deliberate choice at a time. But on quiet nights in Vincent's penthouse, after Stella had worked at the community center and Vincent had managed his empire with slightly less violence, they'd sit together in the lamplight of his office. Stella in the leather chair where Vincent used to sit alone, Vincent on the floor with his head against her knee, her hand resting gently on his scarred knuckles. The two brass keys would catch the light, tarnished and polished, stolen and given, past and future hanging together on the same chain. And Vincent would remember that some promises survive not because they were kept perfectly, but because someone refused to forget what they meant. Because a frightened girl had held a worthless key for 23 years, and a boy who'd become a monster had learned, slowly, painfully, how to become human again. The empire still stood. The violence hadn't stopped completely. Vincent Romani was still feared, still dangerous, still the man who'd executed Marco De Luca over a piece of brass. But in the quiet moments, when Stella's hand rested on his and the keys caught lamplight, he was also the boy who'd made promises in frozen alleys. And for the first time in 23 years, both versions of himself existed in the same body, learning how to survive each other, learning that redemption wasn't an event but a process, learning that some kinds of love were strong enough to survive becoming. The brass keys hung between them, and Vincent understood. This was what the watch had promised all along. Not wealth or escape, but time. Time to heal, time to change, time to discover that the hardest journey isn't from poverty to power, but from darkness back to light. Vincent and Stella's story proves that some promises survive not because they were kept perfectly, but because someone refused to forget what they meant. Now I want to hear from you, wherever you are in the world. Do you believe people like Vincent deserve redemption? Can someone who's done terrible things ever truly change? Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how these themes resonate differently across cultures. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps me bring more stories about second chances, broken promises, and the long road back to humanity to viewers in every corner of the world.